are many challenges. Paul called them costs, barriers, what have you. These include things like mistrust, the need for independence, competitiveness, and so on. So for the second half of the paper, we address the factors that are needed to successfully coordinate within the cluster, including things about what the clusters are doing, who is there at the cluster table, and how these organizations interact together. And I'm going to focus on these various factors for the rest of the presentation. So the first area relates to activities that the clusters are undertaking. So cluster members are more likely to coordinate effectively around activities which meet their organizational needs or which are complex or difficult activities. So for example, clusters are very effective at information sharing because information management is a huge need of organizations. Similarly, as Paul mentioned, advocacy activities often get a lot of support within clusters, especially when the cluster members self-identify a need that they can't address alone and they can't address anywhere else. Therefore, it gets support. The next area relates to cluster membership and composition. Group size, though we thought it might play a role, doesn't seem to really matter that much to how organizations are able to effectively coordinate. However, things like how similar an organizational culture is between the different cluster members, how similar the way they work, the kinds of things that they do, and in terms of having a kind of idea of a common goal or a common picture of how the response is supposed to look, these types of things do play a role in how effectively organizations are able to coordinate with one another. This goes beyond just a nod to coordination in a vision statement, but really is something about institutionalizing a commitment to a cluster, to coordination, such as in the clusters within an organization's culture. So it's much deeper than just kind of saying, we support coordination, absolutely. Despite the evidence and importance, and perhaps the kind of growing calling for a greater role of national organizations in the humanitarian system, we found that national NGOs are insufficiently engaged within the clusters. And there's a range of interrelated issues really at play with this one. National NGOs lack capacity and time. This leads them perhaps to undervalue coordination, or it's lower on a list of things to do. Language and technical barriers are also an issue. And when these are at play, cluster members might struggle to strike the balance between the desire to be inclusive and the reality of needing to take action and move forward with a response. The next area relates to leadership and structure. So recognizing the vital importance of the cluster lead agency, we found that to be effective at coordinating, cluster members really needed the cluster to be a neutral and independent kind of place, particularly where it came to decision making, that it would be important for the cluster not to be influenced by the interests of the lead agency. And one way we found to ensure this happens is for each cluster coordinator to be fully dedicated to the cluster. And double hatting, which is where a cluster coordinator plays a role both within the lead agency and the cluster, is generally seen to be a barrier to effective coordination in the clusters that we met and discussed with. Ensuring that funding relationships between the lead agency and their partners, who also might be cluster members, and also making sure that the lead agency is represented by somebody who isn't the cluster coordinator in cluster meetings, were also things that could be done to help preserve the cluster's neutrality and independence. Involving governments in clusters seem to meet similar barriers to those ones I discussed relating to national NGOs, and also includes things like mistrust and a disconnect between perhaps political and humanitarian imperatives. Clusters seem to have best addressed these challenges by acknowledging the importance of a government to an effective response, by establishing contact early on and ensuring governments are engaged throughout a response, by making realistic connections with all relevant levels of government, and by understanding the roles that government could and would be willing to play. And here we found more examples of effective government involvement where the government was in a leading role as opposed to being in a participatory role in the cluster. The next section dealt with roles and responsibilities of cluster members. And here we found that when cluster members understand and agree on their role, coordination in the clusters is more effective. This underlines the kind of collective responsibility in the cluster whereby there's a difference between coordinating together and being coordinated by someone else. And this understanding seems to develop more often over time, and formal terms of reference or guidance doesn't really seem to play much of an influencing role here. Similarly, the next factor relates to the role of the cluster coordinator. This factor was really important to us given, as Paul mentioned, the previous work we've done on operational leadership. And here the study found that the cluster coordinator does have a very important role, but importantly is not a silver bullet. In other words, you cannot put a skilled and experienced cluster coordinator into a context that's full of mistrust, lacks clarity on process and task, insufficient resources and support, and so on, and expect a magic fix. The importance of the cluster coordinator does relate to the importance of having someone there to move things forward and get things done, and to establish the types of processes and structures that I've already mentioned, which themselves contribute to effective coordination. And so we found that effective cluster coordinators are mentioned on the slide, are clear about their role, have skills in facilitation, team building, communication, are able to be impartial mediators, have support from others within the cluster, including information management officers, subnational clusters, and so on, and have both strong knowledge of the context and sector, and also strong relationships. Information management, as I previously mentioned, is an extremely important part of a humanitarian response and therefore an important cluster function. Effective processes, clear and agreed by members, are also an important part of achieving that effective coordination. Our research found that clusters are effectively collecting information, but perhaps not adequately addressing the other information management functions. There are 6 of them. These are outlined on page 84 of the study. And so clusters, we suggest, need to refocus efforts to ensure that the minimum necessary activities in all 6 of these areas, from collection through to dissemination, need to be there in order to effectively coordinate. Similarly, decision-making is an important process, and we found that the presence of a clear and agreed way of making decisions, no matter what that way was more important than who was actually making the decisions in the cluster. Saying that, clusters seem to be making decisions in one of 3 ways. The first way is that decisions are made by the whole group, either by majority or consensus. And there's advantages here in terms of having a wide set of information and support for a decision, but also perhaps logistical challenges. Other clusters use a small group, sometimes called a strategic advisory group or a SAG. These are organized in a variety of ways, which differ from cluster to cluster, and we found that these were most accepted and useful where there was transparency and diversity in forming the SAG. Interestingly, in over half of the clusters that we looked at, decisions are made by an individual, either by alone or after consulting a wider group. And here, in general, we found concerns about transparency with this model, particularly where, going back to the issue about independence, there were blurred lines between the cluster and the lead agency. One interesting kind of thing that came out of the research that we didn't really expect to find, but was interesting to us, was that decisions made by a group, either the first or second model that I mentioned, were found to be of a higher quality than decisions made by an individual. And at the same time, decisions made by a group seem to be no slower than decisions made by an individual, which casts a shadow on perhaps a commonly held assumption. The final factor that I'm going to mention is that of trust and relationships. And here we found that this was important, and also this area supports other areas that I've discussed, such as information exchange and things like reducing competitiveness, which was one of the barriers that I mentioned earlier. Clusters have established trust in a number of ways, some by emphasizing a culture of openness and trust, others have developed trust because of personal relationships and personalities. And just as relationships can lead to trust within the cluster, they can also cause mistrust and therefore have the potential to be both a supporting factor and a barrier. So these are just some of the factors that I've discussed in the paper, and I know we're running a bit over time, so I've tried to go as quick as possible through them. But we also discuss in the paper the role of funding, subnational level clusters, standards and procedures, who represents the organization, the resources the cluster needs, and so on. And finally, I just wanted to point out that we found that all of these factors are important, and each for their own reasons. And in the study, we didn't identify one factor that's more important than another. Some become more important at certain times in the response or in certain contexts, but overall, there is no one, single answer to it. It's a mixture of all of these different things. And so with that, I will hand back to Graham.